November 13th, 2013. The Mojave Desert, San Bernardino County. A motorcyclist riding through a remote stretch of desert noticed something unusual in the sand, a fragment of bone. When he got closer, it became clear that it was part of a skull belonging to a young person. The man immediately contacted the local sheriff's office. Deputies responding to the call secured the arid area. Just beneath a thin layer of soil, barely covered by sand, the outlines of two shallow graves were visible. A major crimes investigative team and forensic anthropologists were called to the scene. The scale of the operation and the amount of specialized equipment made it clear this was not an isolated discovery, but a mass burial site. During the excavation, forensic specialists recovered the remains of 4 individuals. Based on the size of the bones, investigators determined that alongside 2 adults were 2 young sons. Inside one of the graves, right next to the remains, they found a heavy construction tool, a sledgehammer. The presence of such an object in a grave containing an entire family immediately ruled out any theory of an accident. This discovery, roughly 90 miles inland from the coast, brought an end to one of California's most mysterious missing person cases. As experts were just beginning to package the evidence for transport to the lab, patrol radios were already broadcasting bulletins from 4 years earlier. The remains could belong to a family that had vanished without a trace from their comfortable home, leaving the lights on and dinner unfinished. If this was them, then the official investigative theory, that the family had fled the country, was a devastating mistake, one that cost 4 years of silence. To understand how a seemingly stable family ended up in a shared grave, we have to go back 3 years earlier, to February of 2010, when the story of their disappearance first began. In the small town of Fallbrook, California, the McStay family appeared from the outside to be living the American dream. A recently purchased home, a successful custom fountain business, and 2 young sons. Contact with them ended on February 4th. Patrick McStay, Joseph's father, was unable to reach his son, something that was highly unusual as the 2 spoke every day. After several days with no word, Patrick convinced his other son, Michael, to drive to Joseph's house and check on things. At first, Michael didn't share his father's concern, assuming the family was simply busy settling into their new home, but he eventually agreed to go. When Michael arrived at the property, he immediately noticed that the family's white Isuzu Trooper was not in the driveway. However, the McStay's dogs were still there. The animals appeared neglected and underfed, their bowls completely empty. Michael walked around the house and confirmed that all the doors were locked. To get inside, he had to open a window and climb into the room. Inside, the house felt frozen in time. On the kitchen table, Michael found a bowl of food already covered in mold. Nearby were groceries laid out for dinner, never making it to the stove. In the living room, sitting right on the couch, was a cup of popcorn. Toys were scattered across the floor as if Gianni, age 4, and Joseph Jr., age 3, had stepped away from their game for just a moment. Despite the strange scene and the unattended pets, Michael initially assumed his relatives had left town for an unplanned vacation. However, the complete lack of contact pushed him to call emergency services. Officers arrived and searched every room of the house. There were no signs of a struggle, no forced entry, and no visible bloodstains. Everything suggested that Joseph, Summer, and their sons had left the home in a hurry, with their phones turned off and everyday routines abruptly abandoned. Police launched an official missing person search, unaware that just 4 days later, the family's vehicle would surface in a completely unexpected location. On February 8, 2010, 4 days after Michael McStay climbed through the window of his brother's empty house, the search shifted roughly 68 miles to the south. The family's white Isuzu Trooper was found parked in San Isidro, just a few hundred yards from the pedestrian crossing at the U.S.-Mexico border. The vehicle was locked with no signs of a break-in or biological traces inside. Investigators obtained access to surveillance footage from the border crossing. Grainy video, recorded later that same day, showed a group of 4 people, a man, a woman, and 2 sons, walking toward Mexican territory. The image quality made it impossible to clearly identify faces, but the height and body proportions were consistent with Joseph, Summer, and their sons. At the same time, specialists completed an examination of the computer found in the Fallbrook home. The browser history revealed a series of searches made shortly before the disappearance. Someone had been looking up entry rules for Mexico and required documents for traveling with sons. These details led detectives to a working theory. The McStays had decided to abruptly change their lives and relocate abroad. The relatives of the missing family did not accept this explanation. Patrick McStay insisted that Joseph had no plans to move and was deeply involved in running his company. Joseph's mother, Susan, after repeatedly watching the border footage, stated that the gait of the man seen in the video did not match her son's. Despite the family's objections, police officially classified the incident as a voluntary departure. That decision carried serious legal consequences. Because investigators saw no signs of a violent crime, courts denied warrants to access Joseph's bank accounts or obtain detailed phone records. The family's financial activity remained off-limits. As a result, the active phase of the investigation was scaled back, and the McStay case slipped into cold case status for 3 years. In the eyes of the system, they were simply people who did not want to be found. To understand the full scope of what happened, it's necessary to reconstruct the family's life before February 4th, 2010. 40-year-old Joseph McStay was the sole provider and owner of a company specializing in the design and sale of decorative fountains. His business showed steady growth, allowing the family to move from Los Angeles County into a newly purchased home in Fallbrook. At the time, Summer McStay was 39 years old. She was focused on raising her 2 sons and settling into the recently purchased home. On the day of the disappearance, February 4th, she was in regular contact with her sister, who had recently given birth. In their messages, Summer discussed everyday details and plans for decorating the rooms of Gianni and Joseph Jr. Digital records and messenger data show that Summer was fully immersed in household routines and family matters. That same morning, Joseph McStay was preparing for a business meeting. According to his father, Patrick, they spoke by phone every single day. In 2010, their relationship was described as close and trusting. During their final call, Joseph told his father that he was running late and wouldn't make it to a planned business lunch on time. That brief update about a change in schedule became the last time Patrick ever heard his son's voice. While Joseph was handling work-related matters, Summer remained at home with her sons. Investigators found no evidence of family conflict or financial stress that could have triggered a sudden departure. On the contrary, recent furniture purchases, plans to meet with relatives, and active work on new fountain orders all pointed to the McStays intending to continue their life in Fallbrook. The evening of February 4th was expected to be a routine end to a normal day. But, after the afternoon hours, all outgoing activity from both Joseph's and Summer's phones abruptly stopped. In November 2013, the investigation shifted from searching for missing persons to analyzing physical evidence at a crime scene. The San Bernardino County Sheriff's Office brought in forensic specialists to conduct a detailed examination of the 2 graves that had been discovered. Identifying the deceased had to be done in laboratory conditions. The state of the remains made visual identification impossible. Experts relied on dental records to make comparisons. The analysis confirmed that those buried in the Mojave Desert were Joseph McStay, his wife, Summer, and their sons, Gianni and Joseph Jr. Autopsy results showed that each family member died as a result of severe head trauma caused by repeated blows from a blunt object. As the instrument used in the crime, experts identified a 3-pound sledgehammer that the offender had left in one of the graves. The skulls showed fractures and indentations consistent with the weight and shape of the tool's striking surface. Technical analysis confirmed that the blows were delivered deliberately and with significant force. The medical examiner's report also documented injuries indicating aggressive behavior prior to death. The youngest son, 3-year-old Joseph Jr., had multiple fractures to the head. During the examination of 40-year-old Joseph McStay's remains, forensic analysts discovered an electrical cord tightly wrapped around the cervical vertebrae. According to investigators, the nature of these findings suggested that the family members were subjected to physical coercion before the crime was carried out. Anthropological findings confirmed that the burial had taken place long before the discovery. The condition of the bone tissue was consistent with roughly 3 years in the soil. The haste with which the graves were dug, each only a few inches deep, pointed to a clear intent by the offender to dispose of the bodies as quickly as possible. Now that the cause of death had been officially classified as a crime involving a sledgehammer, detectives shifted their focus to identifying the owner of that tool and scrutinizing everyone who had contact with Joseph on the day he disappeared. Investigators began examining Joseph McStay's business circle within the first weeks after the family vanished. In February 2010, Charles Merritt, known as Chase, was not considered a suspect. Instead, he was treated as a key witness. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's exterior security camera confirmed that Merritt was the last known person to meet with Joseph. Their lunch at a restaurant on February 4th marked the final documented movement of the head of the family. During the period when the McStays were officially believed to have left for Mexico, Chase was openly cooperative. He gave interviews to the media and voluntarily visited the police station for informal conversations. Merritt repeatedly stated that Joseph was his best friend. Even then, back in 2010, investigators noticed a troubling detail in his speech. When describing their relationship, Chase consistently used the past tense. The phrase, "he was my best friend," surfaced 3 years before the family's deaths were confirmed. At the time, with no physical evidence and no bodies, detectives recorded the observation but had no legal grounds to detain him. That changed dramatically in November 2013, immediately after the remains were discovered in the desert. Charles Merritt was summoned for a formal interrogation as a suspect. When detectives confronted him with his own words from 2010, Merritt was unable to explain why he had spoken about his friend as if he were already gone, years before Joseph was found deceased. In response, he claimed he hadn't been mindful of his wording and didn't realize how it sounded. During this official 2013 interrogation, Merritt repeated his account of the day of the disappearance. He stated that during lunch on February 4th, Joseph handed him paper checks to cover ongoing projects for the fountain business. Chase insisted that after that meeting, they spoke by phone 2 more times. These claims became the foundation for the next step in the investigation. Detectives sent the checks and phone records for forensic analysis, determined to verify every minute and every dollar in the story of the so-called best friend. While Charles Merritt was giving interviews about his best friend, FBI financial analysts gained access to the banking records of Joseph McStay's company. The very first review revealed serious discrepancies in the documents Chase cited as proof of his innocence. The focus was on the checks allegedly handed over by Joseph during their final lunch on February 4th. Digital analysis showed that despite the handwritten date of February 4th on the checks, the transactions were actually created and activated in the banking system several days later, at a time when the McStay family had already stopped all communication. Investigators determined that in the period following the family's disappearance, more than $21,000 was withdrawn from the company's accounts. The money was moved through a series of checks, the signatures on which, according to forensic handwriting experts, had been forged by Merritt. A closer look at Joseph's business partner revealed a gambling addiction. Casino records confirmed that in the days immediately after the McStays vanished, Chase was spending large sums at gaming tables, going on extended gambling runs using funds taken from the business. One of the most significant pieces of evidence came from a report filed by the bank's customer support service. Several days after the family disappeared, the financial institution received a phone call from a man who identified himself as Joseph McStay. The caller demanded that the account be completely deleted and that all transaction history tied to his activity be erased. The attempt failed. The caller was unable to provide the correct password, and the bank employee refused to carry out the request. A technical review later traced the origin of the call. It did not come from Joseph's phone, but from Charles Merritt's personal mobile device. Additional clarity came from an email recovered from Joseph's inbox. It was sent on February 1, 2010, 3 days before the tragedy. In the message, McStay directly stated that Merritt owed him nearly $43,000. This information allowed investigators to establish a clear motive: ongoing theft, mounting debt, and an attempt to conceal financial crimes by eliminating the creditor and wiping out his banking records. Alongside the financial audit, investigators focused on analyzing cellular network data. A review of cell tower logs made it possible to reconstruct Charles Merritt's movements during the most critical period. According to the data, on February 6, 2010, 2 days after the McStay family disappeared, Merritt's phone was recorded in the Mojave Desert, in the exact area where the graves would later be discovered. Detectives compared this location data with details from the suspect's background. It turned out that Charles Merritt had grown up in that region and was familiar with the terrain, giving him the ability to navigate the desert away from main roads. On that same day, February 6th, Merritt's phone stopped transmitting signals for several hours before reappearing in residential areas. According to prosecutors, this window of time was used to conceal evidence and prepare the burial sites. A crucial link in the case came from genetic testing of the Isuzu Trooper abandoned near the Mexican border. Despite the absence of obvious signs of a struggle, forensic teams conducted a meticulous collection of biological material from inside the vehicle. The analysis revealed Charles Merritt's DNA on the steering column and the gear shift. This finding directly contradicted the theory that the family had driven themselves to Mexico. The presence of Merritt's genetic material on the vehicle's controls indicated that he was the one who drove the SUV to the San Isidro border crossing after committing the crime. Additional confirmation came from surveillance footage installed at a neighbor's home near the McStay residence. On the night of the disappearance, February 4th, the camera captured a white pickup truck leaving the family's property. Although the image was blurred, technical experts were able to identify the vehicle's size and distinctive body features, which matched Merritt's work pickup. Taken together, phone billing records, biological traces inside the family's vehicle, and the surveillance footage, investigators formed a final conclusion. Charles Merritt had not only taken money from the business, but had personally managed the disposal of evidence and the movement of the bodies. During the trial, the defense team for Charles Merritt attempted to shift responsibility for the crime onto people from Joseph McStay's inner circle. The attorneys pointed to 3 individuals whom they claimed had possible motives or opportunities. First on that list was Michael McStay, Joseph's brother. The defense highlighted what they described as unusual behavior. Michael did not immediately go to check the house after the family disappeared and delayed filing an official report with law enforcement. Particular attention was drawn to a statement Michael made to officers, recorded in police reports before the remains were discovered. During one conversation, he expressed hope that his relatives were not buried in shallow graves. When the bodies were later found exactly that way in the Mojave Desert, The defense presented this as a key argument. The attorneys also claimed that the white pickup truck seen on surveillance footage could have belonged to Michael rather than Merritt. However, the McStay parents and investigators viewed Michael's words as a coincidence and his behavior as a natural reaction of someone unwilling to accept a tragic outcome. The second person the defense suggested as a possible offender was Dan Kavanaugh, Joseph's former business partner in online sales. Known as Dan the Hacker, he had been involved in a prolonged financial dispute with Joseph toward the end of 2009. Kavanaugh demanded a percentage of all company sales, not just online transactions. The conflict escalated to threats, with Dan allegedly warning that he would redirect the company's website traffic to adult content. The dispute was temporarily resolved only after Joseph handed over his BMW and made additional cash payments. Kavanaugh was further implicated by statements from his former girlfriend, Tracy, who claimed in 2018 that he had confessed the crime to her. However, investigators determined that Tracy had a history of abusing prohibited substances and personal grievances against Dan. Kavanaugh himself provided a solid alibi. At the time the McStay family disappeared, he was on vacation in Hawaii. This was confirmed by witness statements and photos posted on social media. Detectives also examined Joseph McStay's past. Before his marriage to Summer, he had been married once before and shared a son named John with his first wife. At the time of the tragedy, Joseph's former spouse was in a relationship with a new partner. Conflicts had regularly arisen between Joseph and this man, primarily over disagreements related to parenting and family responsibilities. Tense relationships and long-standing grievances led investigators to examine a theory of personal revenge. Charles Merritt's defense team attempted to use this angle, pointing to a possible motive involving the former spouse's partner. However, after a detailed review of that man's alibi and movements on the day the family disappeared, police officially ruled him out as a suspect, finding no evidence linking him to the crime. Based on the full body of evidence, prosecutors reconstructed the timeline of the McStay family's final day. On the afternoon of February 4, 2010, Joseph met with Charles Merritt at a restaurant. According to the prosecution, this was the moment Joseph confronted his business partner about repeated theft from the company's funds. 3 days earlier, Joseph had sent an email demanding the return of $43,000. Merritt already had a criminal background involving theft and fraud, and the threat of police involvement meant the possibility of a lengthy prison sentence for him. That same evening, Chase arrived at the McStay home in Fallbrook. Investigators believe he brought a 3-pound sledgehammer with him. Joseph was the first to fall victim to the crime. Merritt then turned on Summer and the two sons. Technical analysis showed that the offender did not rely solely on the sledgehammer. An electrical cord was tightened around Joseph's neck. To create an alibi and steer investigators in the wrong direction, Merritt used Summer's home computer. He entered search queries about border crossing rules into Mexico, attempting to stage the appearance of a planned family relocation. Over the next 2 days, Charles Merritt focused on covering his tracks. During this time, he accessed the company's online banking and issued a series of checks to himself, backdating them to appear legitimate. On February 6th, according to billing records, Chase loaded the bodies into his pickup truck and drove them into the Mojave Desert. There, he dug 2 shallow graves and buried the remains along with the tool used in the crime. The final step of the staging involved moving the family's Isuzu Trooper. Merritt drove the vehicle to the border area in San Isidro and left it in a parking lot, expecting surveillance cameras to capture the SUV near the crossing. The rush to execute the plan led to a critical mistake. Chase left his biological traces on the steering column and the gear shift. After that, he returned to everyday life, continuing to communicate with the victim's relatives and presenting himself as someone sincerely trying to help with the search. On January 7, 2019, a trial began after nearly 9 years of delays. Over the course of the pretrial process, Charles Merritt went through 5 attorneys and even attempted to represent himself at one point. Prosecutors built their case on a combination of financial manipulation, phone billing data, and biological traces found inside the abandoned vehicle. Merritt's defense focused on discrediting the key pieces of evidence. His attorneys argued that the grainy footage from the neighbor's security camera could not, with absolute certainty, identify the defendant's pickup truck. In an effort to establish an alibi, the defense called Charles's former girlfriend, who testified that on the night of February 5, 2010, he was with her. Merritt's sister, Vanita, was also called to the stand. She attempted to suggest that her brother could have been in the desert area because he was visiting her. Prosecutors countered this claim by presenting a recording of Vanita's interview from 2013, in which she clearly stated that Charles had not visited her in the previous 5 years. The victim impact statements became the most emotionally charged part of the trial. Susan McStay, Joseph's mother, referred to the defendant as a coward and a criminal. Patrick McStay reminded the courtroom that Joseph had provided Charles with both financial and legal support in 2009, when Merritt was facing legal trouble. Joseph's older son, John, who was 12 years old at the time his father disappeared, read a statement describing how the tragedy had shaped his life. In response, Charles Merritt addressed the court himself, delivering his statement through tears. He maintained his innocence and claimed that he loved the McStay family. Merritt promised that, before God, he would one day prove that everyone was wrong. The jury, however, weighed not the defendant's emotions, but the established facts, including the attempted deletion of bank accounts and the presence of Merritt's DNA on the gearshift of the Isuzu Trooper. After a brief deliberation, the jury found Merritt guilty on 4 counts of first-degree criminal charges. On January 21, 2020, a judge of the San Bernardino County Superior Court delivered the final sentence. Prior to the hearing, Merritt's defense filed a motion requesting a new trial, citing alleged prosecutorial misconduct, but the court denied the request. At the age of 62, Merritt was formally sentenced to capital punishment for the crime involving 4 victims. California's legal reality, however, altered how that sentence would be carried out. The state's last execution took place in 2006, after which a moratorium was enacted. Under current law, the convicted man was transferred to death row, where he is expected to spend the remainder of his life without the sentence being carried out. Merritt continues to deny responsibility, stating that he intends to prove his innocence in the future. By the time the sentence was handed down, the McStay family's material assets were no longer theirs. The decorative fountain business was sold back in June 2011 for a sum exceeding $100,000. The Fallbrook home, where phone activity from Joseph and Summer abruptly ended on February 4, 2010, has since changed owners. The only physical reminder of what happened that night is a 3-pound sledgehammer preserved in an evidence archive. The tool that ultimately sealed the fate of this story in the sands of the Mojave Desert